This week we are talking about the personality differences, more specifically about what role they play in our different life circumstances. So this is part of finding happiness, is understanding what your vulnerabilities are in your personality, finding out what your strengths are in your personality. For example, if you ever had to hire an attorney to defend you, my guess is you'd want them to be a generally argumentative person. Maybe not with you, but I definitely want to have somebody like that on my side if I had to do that. Similarly, if I had to hire an accountant, I'd probably want them to be really detail-oriented. So these are the kinds of things that we have all these different challenges that we meet all day long, all of our lives. And so we are going to be discussing all the different personality differences. So over the years, I've come across a whole host of explanations about all kinds of personality differences. I go on social media, things like Facebook and Twitter, all these quizzes like find out your personality type, or are you this type of person, are you that type of person, maybe a psychology textbook a little bit more formal, and of course a newspaper astrology section. And but my big question for you, Dr. Lisle, is it seems to be a really popular subject to many people, just based on all the numbers of personality scores and tests out there. Why do people find this so fascinating?
Well, they find it fascinating because what we're trying to do in this life is we're trying to find people to engage in relationships with. And those relationships that we care about most are romance, friendships, business relationships, and then also we are in family dynamics as well. So those are really the four types of relationships that exist for people that they value. There's some other relationships like the guy that's suing you, your enemies, all this sort of thing. But of the relationships that we seek, we actually seek relationships with other people to trade with, to exchange with, to romance with, etc. And so we're very concerned about the individual differences between these people. So as a result, what personality is the study of individual differences. In psychology, you can sort of cleave psychology into two great questions. The first great question is, what is human nature? How is it that humans are different from all of the other animals? And how is it that they are maybe the same in some ways? But essentially, we're trying to figure out about human nature in general. Why do people do what they do? Why do they want what they want? And why do they live the way they do? The other question, though, is within that, what is the nature of the individual differences between the people? So this is the equivalent of, in medicine, a medical doctor studies Gray's Anatomy. So he studies everything about human nature in its biological design. And in one way, all humans are the same. In other words, all women have one anatomy and all men have another anatomy. And if you're a man or a woman, your doctor has studied that anatomy, and that anatomy is fairly good detail. It's the same as every other man on earth. The little tendons are more or less in the same place. They even have names for them. They attach to the certain muscles, the bones in your foot, etc. Every one of those individuals is different. And so part of being a doctor is not only knowing human nature in general from its anatomy and physiology, but also learning about the individual differences between people with respect to that anatomy and physiology. So when you become an expert in the kidney, you don't just learn about the kidney, you learn about the individual differences in the kidney. Human beings are experts in the human personality. That's because they're incredibly interested in the human personality, because human individual differences are the stuff of which people are trying to discern, to make sense of, to predict the nature of the future of any relationships that they start. So that's why people are endlessly fascinated with the question of individual differences, and we are more expert about human personalities than Eskimos are about snow.
At your recommendation a few years ago, I read a book by Jeffrey Miller, who's a promising, evolutionary psychologist. And in his book, he discusses psychology and personality differences and how they relate to consumer behavior. And one of the sentences he starts out his book saying is, you don't need to know much about psychology beyond what you already know about people. And in fact, he goes on and says, the less you've been taught about traditional things like that, the fewer misconceptions you'll have to overcome.
Dr. Miller is not a promising evolutionary psychologist. He is a brilliant evolutionary psychologist. He was he was a stunning star coming out of Stanford in the late 90s or actually early 90s, and then he was by the year 2000, I believe, he had published an extraordinary book. The Mating Mind was a tour de force. It was a brilliant work. And I actually wondered what on earth he could do to follow that up. And many years later, about 10 years later, he would follow it up with Spent, the book that you're referring to, which is the study of consumer behavior from the perspective of personality. Great book.
With all the curiosity surrounding personality, there's so many different personality systems, and one of the most popular ones, I think, is astrology. Now, I have to tell you, my grandmother, she's a diehard astrology reader, and she has books, she's got charts, she's got tables. Every time I'm talking about a girl that I'm dating, she's asking me what her sign is, and of course, after she talks to the girl, she then informs me that she doesn't have the correct sign that I would be compatible with, obviously, and that I'm not going to be a good match. Now,
yeah.
I have to say, we all have eventually broken up, me and these girls, and so she was at least a little right, you know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So what's your sign, Dr. Lisle?
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you a story about that. So I was explaining about why personality had absolutely nothing to do with the zodiac. And I was explaining the science behind this, about how there's the evidence has actually been gathered and computed. So some scientists actually literally went to the trouble, and the notion that the time of year that anybody was born, that all these people that were born, for example, in June, would be much more like each other than all the people that were born in July or August or September, is just totally ludicrous. And of course, there's zero validity to this. So I explain all this in exquisite detail, and the woman says to me, "You must be a Virgo," which unbelievably turns out to be true.
Oh man! And you know what's interesting is I'm a Virgo too, so there must be something to this.
There you go. The bottom line is that a broken clock is right twice a day, and the issue is that the zodiac has survived because of a phenomenon known as Barnum statements, and this was well researched in the mid 20th century by, I forget who did the research, but it was popularized by one of the most brilliant men in the history of psychology, Dr. Paul Meehl at the University of Minnesota. And he explained that when you do personality testing, you can use a bunch of statements that look very discerning, but they apply to everybody. So they'll say things like, this person, really is careful in their judgment. They're in a period of time right now where there's some big decisions to be made. There's some conflict on the horizon with respect to their romantic prospects, and they need to be, thinking deeply about their next move. Okay, well, that all sounds just great, but it applies to everybody. And so astrology has survived and thrives as a result of the human susceptibility to Barnum statements. And anyway, I've pulled this many times as a parlor trick on little groups of people just for fun to show them how this works, and it always works. Everybody's always amazed at the little profile that I've generated for them based on a few questions that I asked them, and all it was the same Barnum statements that their little neighbor right next to them got, and this is how this works. Yeah, astrology is utterly and totally worthless. It's just, but it tells us about an interesting susceptibility in human nature.
The model that Jeffrey Miller discussed, and the one that I've heard from your different lectures, and one that seems to make the most amount of sense to me, at least as a non-professional, as a layperson in this, is what I've heard called the 5-factor model, or the Big 5+1.
Yes.
Can you take us through a little bit about that, and then kind of contrast that to some of the prevailing theories that I may have learned during my general education in college and high school?
Yeah, actually,
like Skinner and Young and all those.
Sure, yeah, we need to go a little broader first. The there's two questions about personality that are important. First of all, what are the nature of the individual differences between people? Can we describe those reliably, and are they true? In other words, is it true that some people are more aggressive than other people, or is it just that sometimes some people are in more provocative circumstances than other people? So or are there real live differences between people? Are some people nicer than others? Are some people truly smarter than others? These are, it seems obvious to us that this is all correct, but a good scientist actually begins at the beginning and tries to make sure that there are, in fact, these differences that people think there are, and then tries to organize them or categorize them to see if they can make sense out of it. Now, the second question is where the differences come from. And so this has been a great mystery in the history of the world. And the world has speculated about about the individual differences in people and where they come from for thousands of years. And it wasn't solved until 1985 at the University of Minnesota. And so unbeknownst to almost anybody writing in your newspaper or even most psychologists that are lecturing at many universities, the truth of the matter is that we've already solved the problem of where the vast majority of individual differences come from. It's genetic. It turns out that adoptive children adopted into a home, do not take on the personality characteristics of the people that adopt them at all. They do not, if their father is very aggressive, their adoptive father is aggressive, they are no more likely to be aggressive than an average member of the population. If their mother is brilliant, they do not take on any characteristics. It doesn't add any IQ points to their mental abilities. They are no more likely to be above average than they are to be below average. In other words, the correlation or correspondence between what you see and what you react to around you has no influence, or essentially no influence, on your personality development. This is incredible. This seems completely counterintuitive to many people, and that is why it was difficult to actually do the research and demonstrate this in a way that was convincing. However, the research has been done. It is overwhelmingly convincing, and this, we now know, is the major source by far of the individual differences in the human personality. So we'll move on now to what these individual differences look like. It turns out that these differences can be mapped in 6 dimensions. There are basically 6 ideas or categories that help us understand human differences. You might call them ingredients. So everybody is walking around with these 6 ingredients, and the 6 ingredients are called, to just confuse everybody now, they're called the 5-factor model. And the reason is there's one additional factor, which is intelligence, that we do not fit into the 5-factor model for just sort of interesting, reasons and idiosyncratic reasons. So we sort of call intelligence a personality factor, but we sort of don't. It's separate from the other 5. The other 5 share a great deal in common with each other in the sense that they tell us a lot about human preferences. So intelligence does not tell us a lot about preferences. It doesn't tell us, whether you like math, whether you like music, whether you like spaceships, whether you like baseball. It does not tell you that. You could be a brilliant human being and you really like baseball, but you really don't like science. You could be not very smart, but really love science and hate baseball. So there's no intelligence doesn't tell you very much about people's preferences. The other 5 tell you all about people's preferences and how it is that they behave in their environments. And so this is what they are. I'll just keep talking I'll briefly go through these. Mm-hmm. The first one is what we're going to call openness to experience. This has to do with how many illegal drugs you want to try, how many sex partners you want to have, how many, bungee jumping incidents that you want to do. If the answer is no illegal drugs, 1 sex partner for my whole life, and I'll never bungee jump, then you're not very open to experience. If that is, if we are saying I can't get enough of all of those things, then you're probably very open to experience. So most people are somewhere in the middle between being very open and being what we're going to call being very conventional. Now, people like to say, "Oh, no, I'm open," but the truth of the matter is most people are not particularly open to experience. And if they think that they are, I can introduce them to some people that will make them seem unbelievably tame. Okay.
And so just to clarify, this is a continuum. It's not like you're either open-minded or closed-minded. And
that's correct.
And this is this kind of reminds me of the back in the Stone Age, the village. They're kind of traveling, trying to find new land and new food. And they're some of them are going to say, well, let's go over the next hill and risk not having a home to come, somewhere to come home to. And some of them are saying, no, we're going to stay. And so the right move is to sometimes move off and sometimes kind of stay, and that kind of sorts itself out over time.
Absolutely right. So openness these things are all genetic, and so we look to genetics and the nature of our species to try to understand why there would be differences in openness and what those differences would serve. And it's exactly as you say. Think of, incidentally, these personality differences are also found in other animals. And so this isn't just, characteristics of people. These are characteristics of DNA. And so think of a rabbit where it lives in a land that has a certain amount of foxes and a certain amount of carrots, and they're distributed in a fashion where there's an ideal distance the average rabbit should go from their rabbit hole in search of food. And let's call that distance 100 yards. You can imagine that most of the rabbits in the environment would go about 100 yards from the hole before they'd start to get anxious. That's just their genes. Their genes would say that's about as far as we should go. We're getting a little too far from the rabbit hole. Now, there would be a few of them that would be willing to go 150 yards. And there'd be a fewer still that would be willing to go 200 yards. So if you were to draw a bell curve and you would say rabbit and you put 100 yards in the middle, that most rabbits would go around 100 yards, but a few of them would be willing to go to 200 yards. Now, the reason why the 200-yard rabbits are fewer than the 100-yard rabbits is that it is a too dangerous of a solution to the problem of how open to experience to be. And so the genes that build that are less numerous in the gene pool because those rabbits are getting eaten by predators. On the other side, you have some rabbits that are going only 50 yards from the rabbit hole and some rabbits that are only going 25. Those are also less numerous, and it makes up the bell curve on the other side of this dimension. So think of this beautiful bell curve where the typical rabbit is at 100 yards, and then fewer on the left at 50, and then fewer still at 25 yards. And then we go up to 150 yards and to 200 yards. So we get this beautiful curve which shows us the individual difference in rabbit openness. This is precisely what you see in humans. So there are humans that, never want to leave, Bakersfield. They're going to marry the first girl they kiss, and, they're going to go to the city college, and they're going to become an electrician just like their dad, and they're going to go to work on their dad's business. This is a very conventional person on the left side of this bell curve, not very open. Whereas somebody else, has to tour the 7 seas and tries to climb the 7 summits and, has taken every crazy drug and just has done every wacky thing that you can think of and has 7 tattoos. And so this individual is on the far open side of this dimension. And most people are in the middle. And so this is because the most effective genes are the ones that are optimized for the environment that we find ourselves in. And that means somewhat open, somewhat conventional. And that's what you see in most human beings.
Okay. And so that's one factor. Let's go over the next one.
Right. The next one is going to be conscientiousness. By the way, for anybody trying to learn this, the 5-factor model spells ocean. So it's going to be openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Okay, so those are the 5, and that can help people remember if they're trying to learn this model. So the second consideration is conscientiousness. So conscientiousness has to do with how meticulous and orderly and worried people are about getting things done properly and doing them right. And so some people are extremely conscientious and detail-oriented. Those would be like your accountant that you were talking about. On the other
Mm-hmm.
side, you could have somebody that's a total flake that doesn't pay their rent, couldn't care less, and has horrible credit rating. So in the middle is most people. Most people turn in their homework on time as kids most of the time. Once in a while, not so much. Most of the people don't play hooky very much from school, but they do once in a while. Those are all in the middle of the bell curve. Then there's people that just drop out of school and completely flake out. Those are on the left side of that bell curve, the flakes. And then you have the hyper-conscientious people on the right-hand side that wind up with anorexia nervosa, if they're women, because they're just so uptight about gaining any fat, or they wind up with straight A's and they have never missed a day of class, kindergarten. So this is the hyper-conscientious on one side of the equation, completely flaky on the other, and the optimal place for a human being to be is somewhere in the middle between these two extremes on that dimension.
Now this reminds me, growing up, every time there was some sort of either party to go to or family gathering or some event, and one of my parents would be stressing, saying, "We're going to be late, we're going to be late, we're going to be late," and the other parent was saying, "Don't worry, we'll be just fine. Even if we come 15, 30 minutes, an hour late, nobody will care." And it was that interesting tension between constantly, we got to be on time and we have to be correct, and versus the it's not such a big deal kind of idea.
Absolutely. You were witnessing that right between your two parents, the differences in their conscientiousness.
And of course, when I come late to family gatherings and they give me slack, I just say, "Hey, don't worry, it's genetic."
There you go. Exactly. That's accurate. The third dimension is going to be, we call it extroversion in our ocean model, but it means introversion, extroversion. All these things are poles. There's one type of person is on one pole, another type or style is on the other pole, and most people in the middle. So introverts are not necessarily shy. They prefer things to be quiet, and they prefer to not have a lot of people around. They may be perfectly assertive in social situations and actually reasonably relaxed. They just prefer to not be there. In order to be shy, you have to add another dimension, which is going to be neuroticism on the bottom of ocean. And in other words, that's going to be a sort of excitable nervous system that gets actually a little bit agitated and nervous about things. So if you add that to an introvert, that is what a shy person is. So we're going to find that combinations of these things will give rise to patterns of behavior that you'll see. In the history of the world, people have tried to come up with types of people, like Carl Jung saying, well, introverts and extroverts. But really, this is an incorrect view of looking at people. People are basically like a cake, or they're like a recipe. And we have to use all 6 of these ingredients to come up with a profile that really fits them. So you have probably never met anybody in this world that has a profile very similar to yours. You have to look at, if you were to use simply 3 demarcations on a bell curve, low, medium, and high, with respect to each of these 6 variables, that would give us 729 different combinations. And so you may have met people that have some of these, might have 4 of these pretty close, but the other 2 are actually significantly different, and they have some very significant differences in personality between you and them. So anyway, introversion, extroversion. The extroverts, very outgoing, very comfortable with a lot of people. They like to be around a lot of people. They just like a lot more social interaction, and most people are somewhere in the middle. Now, the next dimension is going to be how agreeable people are. And so you were speaking earlier about a lawyer. So, yeah, not good lawyers are generally not agreeable people. So, again, we have a bell curve where most people are in the middle, and then there's some people that are very disagreeable, and then some people that are very agreeable. And the world is full of people seeking agreeable people because they're really nice to be around, and if you ask them to do stuff, they do it. And these are very exploitable humans. The disagreeable people
sounds like I'm at the poker table
already. Yes, exactly. And so this is what's happening in human relations, is that people are scanning each other for these characteristics, and there are characteristics that are exploitable, i.e., very attractive, and there are characteristics that are less attractive, and people make friends and seek mates and seek business relationships, people that have certain of these characteristics that they need for whatever it is that they are trying to establish. So agreeableness is a major, is one of these major characteristics, and agreeable personality characteristics are, in fact, the most single sought-after characteristic in men and women for romance worldwide. And you can see why, because if you're going to spend an awful lot of time with an individual, you're going to want them to be reasonably pleasant about conflicts between you, and that's why agreeableness is such an attractive individual difference characteristic.
Just to clarify, I've always assumed that agreeableness and disagreeableness, because it's rare for me to have heard those words outside of this type of discussion. But for me, it's disagreeableness is propensity to disagree. Is that fairly accurate?
Disagreeable is a jerk. They're disagreeing with people. They're disagreeing with people a lot. They tend to feel like they're being cheated, they're being chiseled, and they don't like the deal. So they don't want to agree to it. Whereas the agreeable person is saying, sure, fine, whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, whatever movie you want to see, whatever you want to eat, it's fine. Disagreeable person is putting up barriers to transactions because they're wanting to renegotiate. And so this is disagreeable people are fantastic when they're negotiating for your union or when they are representing you as an attorney. This is exactly what you want, but they are problematic and difficult when it comes to human relations in general.
Now, in general human relations, we want it to feel like it's about even, right? It's about fair, maybe about 50-50, even though it may not be 50-50 every single time we interact with each other. So we want it to feel 50-50. Whereas disagreeable people, it doesn't feel 50-50 unless it's, say, 60-40 in their favor or 70-30 in their favor. Whereas agreeable people, they don't feel like it's fair unless it's 40-60 in the other person's favor. And so they were much more likely to give more than they take. Is that?
Yes, that is very accurate. And so occasionally in long-term relationships, this is sort of the seeds of the old saying that opposites attract. This is the only dimension upon which you will see this. That in anything else, for example, in romance, you will never see highly intelligent people attracted to stupid people. You will never see this. It doesn't happen. Okay? They seek people that are similar to themselves. People that are highly open to experience do not seek people who are very conventional. And neither do people that are very conventional seek people that are highly open. People actually seek similarity across these characteristics. The only place where this is different is in the agreeable-disagreeable dimension, where highly disagreeable people will seek highly agreeable people. And that is that these are the only people that make sense to them. The disagreeable people who are looking at the world essentially from the eyes of when it's 80-20 their way, it feels fair. The only people that they can find to agree with them are the people that are 20-80 traders that are basically saying, gosh, I agree with you. It's perfectly fair. And so you will find these strange-looking relationships where the woman is just like this incredible wench and is just very difficult to deal with, but she's got this docile, pleasant husband, and they've been together for 25 years. On the other hand, the guy could be just this terror, tyrant, and just wants things his way, and he's got this sweet wife who just lets him walk all over her. Those relationships can be in an equilibrium to the point where they are stable because those two individuals actually can agree, whereas an 80-20 trader will not be in a relationship very long with a 50-50 trader, because a 50-50 trader will quickly feel like the 80-20 trader is constantly trying to exploit them, and the 80-20 trader will feel like they are being cheated. As the 50-50 trader wants things in a way that to them feel unfair. So this is the one dimension where opposites attract.
And so there's nothing that somebody who was born an 80-20 or a 20-80 can really do about it. They just have to seek out the ones. Well, I guess if you're a 20-80, meaning you're more agreeable, then if you find somebody who's also 20-80, that's just a beautiful relationship where you're both getting 80%.
These people are they're just walking hand in hand down the beach. They haven't had as much as 3 arguments in 27 years. Yeah, these people are just so sweet. You just can't even stand it. Okay, so yes, these people exist, and in chemistry, we would say that these are like carbon atoms. The agreeable people. They're just so they can hook up with anything. If you're a 20-80 trader, 50-50 people love you, and it's all good. It's all pleasant because the 50-50 person is easily getting more than they think is fair. All they have to do is push a little bit, and they're getting 60-40. But the 20-80 trader on the other side, getting 40% of a deal, feels like they're getting over-rewarded. So, the highly agreeable people are very attractive and usually plucked up and put into relationships pretty quickly. Incidentally, a lot of people think they're highly agreeable, but they're not. So our last dimension is what we call neuroticism, or how agitated or sort of agitatedly upset people can get, or how excitable they are. So people that are extremely emotionally stable, it's hard to get them excited about anything. Those would be the very stable dimension, or non-neurotic. People that are very agitated and easily agitated about things and upset, or including very excited, those people are what we could call them neurotic, but I would just call them excitable. And so this dimension of excitement in the nervous system, again, you can think about the genes trying to solve the problem of how much energy to put out to a given opportunity. And so if you, let's suppose you came up with the idea for a new play that you wanted to put on Broadway, and it really was quite ingenious. If you talk to your stable friend says, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's worth the trouble. You know what I'm saying? Thing about a bunch of people dressed up like cats singing, that just sounds kind of silly, and just forget the whole thing, okay? Whereas if you talk to your wacky friend who's very, very excitable, they're going to be all over it. Okay? They're going to be very excited about this. And, in fact, that is who it is that you're going to see that usually goes in big on any kind of a process, is going to be your very excitable kind of people. So Steve Jobs, just to help people map this out, if you were to look at Steve Jobs, you find an extraordinary personality that then gives rise to an extraordinary career. So he was extremely bright. He was extremely open to experience. He was extremely conscientious. He was actually very outgoing and extroverted. He was extremely disagreeable. And he was extremely neurotic. So literally, Steve Jobs had not a single personality characteristic that was anywhere near the middle of the target. And as a result, we wind up with a brilliant, open, just tyrannical, fanatical, highly conscientious, business genius that creates the most valuable company on earth from starting when he was 28 years old or whatever it was. And that's incredible that what someone like that could accomplish. But it did not happen by accident. Had Steve Jobs been even anywhere near the middle of the bell curve on any single one of those 6 characteristics, an Apple computer would not have happened.
And so are there personality characteristics that are more likely to show up in certain professions than others?
Oh, no question. So attorneys are much more likely to be argumentative. There's no question about that. That just immediately leaps to mind. That's also true of police officers. Anybody in law enforcement where there's contentious problems being dealt with. So if you've got to have some serious disagreeable to you to want to stop people and pull them over and tell them you're going to write them a ticket. Now, I'm not saying these people are highly disagreeable naturally, but they are more disagreeable than average. If you're an artist, you are overwhelmingly likely to be open to experience. That's just how it is. Doesn't matter what kind of art we're talking about, whether you're a painter, a sculptor, or you're a musician, or you are an actor. Those people, the openness is part of the creative process, and so we're going to find that there. We're not going to find very much open to experience in accountants. They are they are going to tend to not be that way. They're just going to be far more conventional in their psychology. So if we just sort of look our way through what we're likely to see, it's all going to make quite a bit of sense. Psychologists in general are going to tend to be agreeable. They're going to tend to be people who are comfortable listening to people talk about their issues and trying to stay quiet and trying to be sympathetic. Not that I haven't met some real disagreeable psychologists. I have, but you will tend to see agreeable people in something like psychology.
We walk around and we see all kinds of different people, and we are simply advertising our personality characteristics to each other, either by the way we dress, i.e. the businessman who has a perfectly tucked-in shirt and a perfectly centered belt and a tie and a jacket and perfectly pressed and cleaned, trying to advertise that he's both intelligent and conscientious and stable, and so we're just advertising those things right and left, whether it's through physical, through clothes, or through conversation, or through mannerisms. If there's any listeners that are if there's any listeners that are calling and want to call in, our number is 657-383-0751. Again, number is 657-383-0751. So it's really quite fascinating that we are actually displaying these, and we can figure this out just by talking to somebody if we were aware of this type of model. How do we figure out our own personality?
Well, the truth of the matter is that most people know their own personalities pretty well. I would say the exception is going to be, moderately disagreeable people tend to think that they're more agreeable than they are. They've got a blind spot there. But people are usually not that blind when it comes to these other things. And so if you go online and you take a Big Five personality test, you can fill it out. There's a whole bunch of them that are all public domain. And they're all about the same, and they come up with very similar scores because it's pretty simple. You just think to yourself, okay, well, let's begin with intelligence. So guy thinks he's a genius, but he was a B student in high school, and then he kind of flunked out of the JC. Well, I think we're pretty sure he's not a genius. So think of the bell curve as running from somebody who is at the a 1 out of 100 in terms of he's the stupidest guy out of 100 versus somebody that's dead average in the middle at 50, and then somebody who's number 100 at the top. So if we think of it as percentiles in terms of a bell curve, most people know more or less where they are in terms of percentile. So if you're pretty smart, went to college, graduated in your 4 years or so, and you've got a moderately difficult degree, you're probably, and you did quite well but did not super well, you're probably somewhere in the 80th to 90th percentile range. If you went to a fancy school and did quite well and did decently at a really higher end school, then you're going to be in the top 5 percentile without any problem. If you're a person who graduated from high school and really just did so in high school and either didn't really feel like going to college because it was just too tough, you're somewhere in the middle of the bell curve, somewhere around the 50th percentile. So people know, and they can tell the individual differences in human intelligence usually within less than a minute of conversation. You can tell a tremendous amount about somebody's intelligence. Now, it may take a little while longer, listen to them a little longer and have a little more conversation, but we know. We can tell, and so that's not a difficult thing for people to answer. Openness is also not that difficult. So people don't want to hear that they're not open because that doesn't sound good. But the truth is that open people do crazy, wacky things. They're sniffing mushrooms and they're jumping into the water with sharks. They're doing all kinds of crazy stuff out there at the far end of the bell curve. If you are, spiritual and go to seances, but you haven't done anything really crazy, then we know you're on the upper end of that bell curve. But you are not really wacky. Okay, so if you are more conventional and you don't really want to do anything that's too strange, you like to go to the Giants game, and you like to play catch with your kid, and et cetera. And the most exciting thing you ever did was do a wheelie on your 10-speed for when you were a teenager. You're in the middle of the bell curve somewhere. And then if you are very you don't even like to hear music that isn't out of a certain genre and really normal, like you just like your country music and that's all you like, you're probably not very open to experience. So people can sense this if they just use a little bit of insight and compare themselves to other people on these dimensions, and they can figure it out. If you think you're real conscientious, but you've got you've quit some jobs and been a little flaky with your payments, and you were sort of a so-so student in school and didn't turn in your homework on time, you're not in the upper 10 percentile for conscientiousness. Those people are the guy that has his tie centered and tied perfectly, and his suit is cut just right.
My dad used to have a saying. He said, it's good to have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
Yeah, there you go.
The thing that is interesting about personality is we've all met people who are in denial. And you kind of touched on it with the agreeable and disagreeability. Can you expand a little bit more about how someone might think that they're a certain way, but they're not really fooling anybody except for themselves?
Yes, there are characteristics that are more esteemed than others. So intelligence is esteemed. So people will try to sell that they are a little more intelligent than they are. Openness is esteemed. So people will try to sell that they're a little bit more open than they are. And conscientiousness is also esteemed. And extroversion is esteemed. And agreeableness is esteemed. And so is stability. So it's going to turn out that these things actually have a valence of value. There's going to be what I call an esteem dynamic between two people that sit and looking at each other across these 6 dimensions. So the esteem dynamic goes that if you are the more intelligent of the two, the esteem is flowing from them to you. Okay, that is the dynamic. If they are reasonably close to you, then the esteem can flow back, because if, let's suppose, one person is extremely bright and the other person is pretty bright. Let's suppose it's a college student who's a pretty good student asking a really smart professor a question or expressing their admiration. The professor can enjoy the fact that they are highly esteemed by this individual who is reasonably worthy. And they will. So as a result, the student is esteemed more by the professor because the student esteems the professor. So this is a circle of esteem process that's going on. Now, let's suppose that the student is not very bright at all and not doing well in the class at all, and they express their esteem for the professor. The professor does not esteem that student because they are frustrated and they feel like that student really doesn't have anything to contribute. And so this is why you will not see very bright people and low ability people hanging out together, is because they cannot generate an esteem dynamic between them. And you will not find this in romance. So people have to be reasonably similar to have this sort of circular dynamic that goes on between them. The same thing is true with openness. So a person who is very open and a person who is moderately open can have an esteem dynamic. The moderately open person esteems the open person's greater life experience and adventurousness, and they admire it. They consider it courageous and fascinating, and that is because the person who is more open has literally covered more of life's territory per unit of life. They have experimented more and managed to survive, and so they actually have more information in their head in various domains than the person who is less adventurous, and so that makes them valuable. You can mine that information. But you're only interested in that information if you're sufficiently open that you might consider doing what they did. If they're at the 95th percentile for openness and they've been to Kathmandu and they've hiked up to the base camp of Everest, but you're somebody that never wanted to leave Bakersfield, then you do not esteem the fact that they went to the Kathmandu, and you are not interested in their stories because you're never going to go. And so as a result, you cannot have an esteem dynamic between the highly open and the highly conventional. It doesn't work. So this is for friendships. This is for romance. It does not work the same in business relationships, because in business relationships, I don't really care if I have a surgeon that's putting my leg back together. I really couldn't care less how open to experience or anything else he is. I just need him to do this very, very narrow technical problem, and I need him to do it right. Okay, so that's all I'm interested in. I'm interested in his conscientiousness and his intelligence. I couldn't care less about how introverted or extroverted this guy is. But on all these other dimensions, all these other human relationships, these dimensions have to work within what I call an esteem dynamic range, and that's how human relationships work.
Well, let's say you got in an arranged marriage, 80 years ago or whatever it was, where there was a village pressure where you just couldn't break up. Is there a way you can change your personality to maybe fit more within the group?
No, you cannot. And so this is why arranged marriages are a disaster, and this is why the worldwide evidence on arranged marriages indicates how miserable people are in them. You cannot change your personality. You cannot force yourself to esteem characteristics about an individual that is outside of your esteem trading range. Just can't be done. There's certain people that have the genes where they really like cilantro, and then there's people that can't stand it. I was reading Match.com profile 10 years ago, and she said, by the way, I cannot understand why anyone would ever willingly eat cilantro. And I thought, fantastic, there's my girl, because I don't understand it either. So this is nobody's going to teach me to like cilantro. That will never happen. Nobody's ever going to teach me to esteem, for example, somebody who's low in conscientiousness. It's just never going to happen. I can't even tolerate someone who is average in conscientiousness. That is not possible. I'm sitting somewhere in the 80th to 90th percentile in conscientiousness, and somebody that's 50th percentile is just below the bar when it comes to either friendship or romance. I can't tolerate it. And this is not unique to me. This is a mapping of the mystery of human relationships, is to understand how personality is configured and how the esteem processes work with respect to these individual differences.
Can the cost-benefit skew sufficiently to, say, make you eat cilantro for an extended period of time? For example, let's say Heidi Klum comes in and says, hey, Doug, if you eat some cilantro with me for about 3 months, then maybe we can start dating. Or maybe you will date while you eat cilantro. Methinks you may start to pretend that you like cilantro for a little bit, no?
Of course. If she made a nice Mexican dish and was serving it and had cilantro all over it, I would sing its praises. Okay? So, of course, that's true. So you can act differently than the truth, and you can be deceptive about what it is that your real personality is, and in order to try to be more attractive for some situation. So the classic of this is the interview question in business that says, well, okay, we've heard about your strengths. What about your weaknesses? Well, sometimes I get so absorbed that I just don't pay attention to the time, and I'm just such a perfectionist, like that. That's the story. Nobody ever says, actually, sometimes I just feel like calling up, and I just call up and I said, I'm sick, just because I don't feel like coming in. That's just, sometimes I feel like that, and that's what I do. Like, nobody says this. Okay, so people will be as deceptive as they can in situations where there is benefit on the table for being differently than you are. In early romance, there is an understanding that part of demonstrating emotional stability, conscientiousness, and agreeableness is to actually be somewhat different than you are. In other words, show extra levels of consideration, show extra levels of interest and empathy. These are ways that people demonstrate essentially where it is that they are likely to be on the bell curve. A woman knows that a man is not going to be as attentive and as careful about everything in the early going in a dating relationship as he's going to be, 3 months later. So she knows she's getting his best foot forward. But that is to be expected in that situation. And so she's discounting what it is that she's seeing, but she's also comparing it to other people and how it is that they behaved in a similar situation. And so if you are the most conscientious guy in the first hour of a date that she's seen in a couple of years, she knows what that means. You won't always behave this way, but she knows you are likely to be a very high conscientious person.
Are there any examples of some ways that people fall into some traps due to certain personality vulnerabilities? How they can beat those genes, in essence?
Yes. One of the great disasters in human life is the people that are, particularly people that are conscientious and agreeable. And if you add intelligence to that, it's a disaster. So if you are intelligent, conscientious, and agreeable, this is what I call the sucker triad. You are a very attractive person to other people. Your intelligence is useful for solving problems. Your conscientiousness is useful because if you begin something, you're going to do a very good job of it. And your agreeableness is useful because I might be able to talk you into it. So if I can talk you into it and you'll agree to do it, you will do it and you'll do it well. That makes you a very valuable commodity in the world. These people, conscientious, intelligent, agreeables, these people wind up getting exploited. These are the people that the burdens of the world fall on their shoulders, and they wind up spending, basically their lives running around worrying about everybody else's problems that they've been burdened with. This is a big problem for Beat the Genes. And so what these people need to do is they need to be instructed as to what these personality characteristics are that they have, and they need to be shown how it is to get out of things. Okay, so they need to. This is what I call how to get out of it. There are a set of techniques on my website at esteemdynamics.org that sort of tells this story. I tell this story in a video that I have posted there called Success Forces. And if you watch this video, it tells the story of pushy people and the sucker. And if you are a conscientious, agreeable kind of person, no matter how smart you are, if you tend to be highly conscientious and quite agreeable, and you're getting pushed around and exploited, and you're always getting burdened, you could use what's on the website on that video to tell you the story of how to push back.
For the pushy people, they're just kind of going to be pushy, and they'll get their way, and that's just going to be how it is.
That's how it's going to be. They're going to get their way a lot. So the disagreeables never feel like they've got enough, but they're getting more than their share routinely.
Mm-hmm.
That's how that works.
The very disagreeable ones are the ones who stand in a line, and then they say, well, why should I stand in a line? I've got stuff to do at home or stuff to do at work.
Absolutely.
I'm just going to push through the line and cut through the line.
Yes. A good friend of mine went to Disneyland as a child with a friend of his whose mother was extremely pushy. And she looked at the long line like of the Matterhorn, and she marched those boys up to the head of the line, and she said, "These boys can't wait," and put them right in there. And my friend never forgot that. And he looked at that situation and just said, "Oh, my God, this is going to work." And it did. The people around were sufficiently agreeable, and that's what happened. So that's happening all over the place.
In this scenario, the child who sees this and says this could work, were they already disagreeable?
Well, no, I think my friend turns out that he's somewhat disagreeable. But the thing is that it was instructive for him. It was a little moment in life where he realized just how useful it was to be pushy. And he had not ever considered to have the audacity to be that pushy. And so, you're not going to talk anybody into doing that that's an agreeable person. They're never going to do it. But a person that's already disagreeable that sees that, they very well might imitate that a whole bunch of times and just see what comes of it. So I believe he has.
You're getting my game strategy wheels turning now. So thank you very much, Dr. Lisle, for coming on. Dr. Lisle, your website again is esteemdynamics.org. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You can schedule consultations with Dr. Lisle if you need to, and there's even the video of the perfect personality where he goes over in detail again about the different personality characteristics.
Very good.
Thank you very much for coming on.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Nate.